Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, I propose that we start with our panel on the issue that is very interesting for us here in the region. The EU's great accomplishment, Big Bang enlargement. We have distinguished panelists with us, two from the founder countries and two from, let us say, maybe the best adjusted new members in the EU. It means Germany, Italy, Slovenia, Czech Republic. Our panelists are Mr. Ambassador Martin Powiesiel. He is a senior Czech diplomat. His professional portfolio was at the time third world and development issues, but European affairs and security policy, bilateral relation, multilateral diplomacy. He is now Deputy Foreign Minister for Security Policy and Multilateral Affairs. Mr. Ivo Weigl, he's also a diplomat. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia, Slovenian ambassador, in several Nordic Baltic countries, Sweden, first of all, Austria, Germany. We have with us Natalie Tocci. She is a very important strategist, director of the Istituto di Affari Internazionali, dealing with security and defense issues, especially, but also European foreign policy, conflict resolution, Middle East, Mediterranean, everything that is relevant for us. We have with us Bernd Hattermann, Secretary General of the European Movement in Germany, but also Vice President of the European Movement International. So this is European Movement corner of this panel. I would suggest that we start with questions immediately. We try to learn a lot, especially from Visegrad Group, think tank community in the Western Balkans. So we had very close cooperation with think tanks of Visegrad Group countries. So from the Big Bang cluster, we are maybe the most familiar with the Visegrad experiences of Visegrad Group countries. But would you agree that the European Union has played the role of a convergence machine, especially in the economic field? Somehow it seems now that economic convergence is going faster on the East-West relation than on the North-South relation. I would like your comments. Maybe Natalie?
Yes, I mean, I think that if one looks at the question of convergence and indeed sort of unpacks it between the economic and the political, then I think this is really a story of lights and shadow. So the light in this particular respect is the economic domain. I mean, it's very clear that convergence process has taken place, and there has been a very, if one just kind of rewinds back and think that at the beginning of the accession process of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, the GDP per capita of Poland was the same as that of Ukraine. One only needs to think about that situation and think about what the current situation is today to think about how we live in a completely different universe. The problem, of course, is that that economic convergence has not been matched by the same political convergence. And this is, in a sense, the story of, if one thinks of enlargement as a big success story, I mean, this is definitely not only the dark side of it, but it's definitely a dark side of it, which is also hampering the current enlargement process. I mean, the very fact that indeed there is this very strong awareness that ultimately the instruments, the incentives, the policies, the impact that the European Union can have when you're out of the Union is very different from that you can have once you're in the Union, has created a problem that we did not anticipate. And this really has to do with the strength and the resilience of institutions, and it is something that, and ultimately that is what makes a difference between a democracy or a liberal democracy and an illiberal democracy. And this is not something that can be built over the course of months or even years. I mean, these are decades-long processes, and obviously given that one cannot imagine that something like the enlargement process in a credible way lasts for decades and decades on end, then I think there is a very real question that has to be addressed, and it's an internal EU question that has to be addressed about how indeed to ensure that those standards of democracy and rule of law and separation of powers and all of the good things that we talk about are actually maintained within the Union. I think this is definitely the story of shadow, and it is a shadow that is lurching not only on the Big Bang enlargement countries, but perhaps in some respects even more dramatically on the countries that are currently in the enlargement process too.
But would you agree that security issue was also very important, and that new member countries also brought greater security to the European Union, that this is also an unquestionable issue?
Yes, and I think that, if you like, the narrative as to why we had to do it, I mean, it was a historical imperative, and it was indeed about security. It was more than security, I would say it was about peace. I mean, it was about reunification. But in a sense, it was such a powerful narrative that we didn't question. We kind of thought everything else was detail. And now we see how it's actually not just detail. Those details are important, because ultimately they do risk a hollowing out of the value base within the Union itself. So they, yes, peace, but it was not an unconditional peace, if you like. One did have to look at the details and the conditions to ensure that peace was actually a consolidated one over the decades.
Maybe Mr. Hotterman would like to...
What I love with this panel, and thank you again for inviting me, what I love with this panel is to go backwards and to look into the future. That is, I think, the setting of this panel, and to invite different perspectives, of course. In my point of view, as I witnessed 3 years in the government office in Slovakia, how the accession process of a country, 3 years accession, how successful it was in the end of the day, I think we should not make too much shadow into the past what happened. If we just think about what would have happened without this process, it's crazy. It would be a crazy situation. I could not think about how the impact of Russia would be now in Eastern Europe, in Central Eastern Europe. I would not think about anything else. I would not think that the Western European countries would be as united, more united in foreign policy as they would be now, and they couldn't cope with it because they wouldn't have the instruments. So we should be very grateful that this was done, maybe not in the big bang form it was done. The latest questions about Bulgaria and Romania, of course, yeah. But I think there was momentum they used. And I'm a German, I'm a West German, and I live in East Berlin. And yes, I mean, convergence, you talked about this economic part. Of course, it's a success story for the continent, it is also by far more a success story for Germany, but people are not there yet. People feel mistreated even by Western politicians because they are getting the key positions in Eastern German states. There's no professor in no university coming from East. There's no judge in East Germany. So you see what I mean? It cannot be done within one generation to make everything right. Even you plan it well, if you have a lot of money you put inside, people are not happy. And that has to do simply with the fact that you cannot just make everything undone what communism was harming before. You cannot make it undone within one generation. It doesn't work. And the other thing I would like to say is when we look at the overall idea what this Big Bang enlargement made is, I talked with a very nice wise man. He's the ambassador of Denmark in Germany, and he was the father of the Copenhagen criteria. And I found it out very late that he was in the cabinet of, I think, Rasmussen in those days, foreign minister. And we talked about the Copenhagen criteria, the famous ones. You look at the third and all economic and democratic stuff. There's nothing written about civil society, by the way. There's all democracy and economic convergence. And not too much about chapters and technocratic stuff. It is really saying where we have to go to. And he said, of course, that was a Danish model. There was a Danish society model behind that, a Danish business model also, pluralistic model. And I think in that days they tried to impose these ideas. They're already in the Western countries. They already forgot about it. So everything what happened in Italy has nothing to do with the fall of the wall. It has to do, of course, yes, but the internal problems of Italy afterwards have other reasons. So Western Europe was not doing the homework, what we always say to countries which want to enter the EU. Western Europe was not doing the homework. We are now paying the price, and also the countries who want to enter the EU are paying the price again. Britain is the biggest disaster. France is another disaster now since yesterday again, another one. Germany has many small disasters. So I think we need a new strategy to come to a new point, to learn that we all have to find a new way of making this integration process, which it is, a success story. But if we go backwards and say that was wrong, I don't believe that, and this is not right, and will give us a lot of harm for future.
Well, it was exactly my next question, because it was not only this group of new member countries that benefited from the enlargement, but also old EU member countries. The benefit was mutual. Benefit in economic terms, security terms, even geopolitical terms. Europe became a much stronger player at the global scene. So the process had a very strong political motive, not only economic. I would like to hear the opinion of our panelists from Czech Republic and Slovenia, how they perceive benefits of their countries and benefits of old EU member countries, of 15 members at that time.
Thank you. First of all, I agree that the enlargement so far has been one of the biggest successes of the European Union. Certainly, in terms of external operations, to stabilize in one go a very substantial part of Europe, inject a positive perspective in terms of economic growth, democracy, freedom, and stable democratic institutions. That is something that really deserves all our admiration, and we should be grateful. to those in the West and in Central and Eastern Europe who made it possible. And I would agree, it's questionable whether this should have happened in one go or in two goes or three goes. Today we know that we imported into the EU some problems that I would say, are now almost endemic. The Cyprus question is not solved, though the expectation was, that it would be solved within a couple of months or short years, and we are still with them, and they do create real obstacles as to how we operate, how we are able to operate internally and outwards, from the EU. And I think that the enlargement injected new energies and new perspective into the older or old members of the EU. Certainly, today, the perception of Eastern Europe beyond the borders of the EU is different from what it would be without the enlargement. The same applies to this region. I think the Balkans would look in a completely different way in Brussels if it hadn't been for the EU enlargement of 2004 and the subsequent enlargement when Bulgaria and Romania were joining. I do not want to dwell on the economic conditions. The market is much larger. That creates new avenues for prosperity. It creates also new problems for the, a deeper integration of the single market that we know. But so far, in my view, up until now, the EU has been able to wrestle with it more or less, in a decent way. And we certainly would hope that with the new institutional cycle, we don't have a rollback period on internal market in the years to come. I quite openly say that we do see some indications in that direction. In terms of convergence, I do want to leave aside, the economic side of it. That's unquestionable. But I would speak about the difficulties I see. First is the political divergence that Natalie alluded to. But I see a growing political divergence, including in Western Europe. If you look at the political scene, today's political scene, in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany itself, it's a completely different picture from that we had when we were joining the EU in 2004. And I do not want to say that it's something very similar to what we see in Central and Eastern Europe, but it certainly is not anything completely different from what we see in Central and Eastern Europe. So this is the political divergence, the evolution away from the political center around which EU has been built and has been functioning is clear both in the West, in Central Europe, and in the eastern part. And third remark, I think when we were joining the EU, or when we were admitted to the EU, we thought that by doing this, our institutions would be 100% stable and solid, rock solid, as those that we see traditionally in the West, be that in the UK, France, the Netherlands, or Germany. I do not want to say that now our institutions would be unstable, but with the growing political divergence, I see more risks As for the institutions in Central and Eastern Europe, including my country that generally is considered very stable, then the risks to the institutions in the West. That is something I'm convinced we need to pay attention in the years to come.
Thank you, Mr. Weigel.
If I speak about the feeling of people in Slovenia, are they satisfied? Do they see the benefit of membership in European Union? I must tell you, it is overwhelming majority. 80% of people in Slovenia are absolutely satisfied being in European Union, and there is no doubt about it. Maybe when we are speaking on this place in Belgrade, we should be clear about it. There are just advantages if you have a European prospect, if you join European Union. There is no doubt about it. But maybe it should be said also that the countries of former Yugoslavia have, including those who are now in the situation of being candidates, have a different starting points than the countries of the Eastern Bloc. We did have a decent kind of market economy. We did have an experiment which only history will say was it positive overall or just an experiment of self-management and so-called social ownership, etc. So we didn't have the hardcore communist, neither economic politics nor ideological and politics. The situation was slightly different, and I think it could be taken into consideration also now when we are talking about the ability of the countries of Western Balkan to cope with the criteria. I heard in the previous panel a critical opinion of gentlemen over there about Copenhagen criteria. About the fact that countries who join in the European Union in the first Big Bang group, they were bound with the Copenhagen criteria. Of course they were. But I can tell you, in 10 years in European Parliament, where I was member of the Committee for Foreign Affairs, I was rapporteur for North Macedonia. At that time it was FYROM. I was shadow rapporteur for Serbia, for Montenegro, and for Croatia. And we negotiated on Copenhagen criteria, of course. The negotiations were on the basis of Copenhagen criteria. It was the Copenhagen criteria were not put ad acta. They are still there, and it is quite a tough process. And it is a process which smart politicians in the candidate countries could use as a very serious exercise in order to make their system being in concordance with the rules and norms of European Union. So it is not just random criteria, but these are criteria well known, and negotiations are tough, and also I must tell you that also the money which European Union is investing in the countries while they are negotiating, while they are candidates, are relevant. So saying this, I think it is fair to say that the first big bank countries have been lucky. We have been lucky because we were some kind of driven by the agreed wish of European Union to overcome the differences and to make these countries as soon as possible members, full-fledged members of community, of common house. It will be much more difficult now, but we will probably speak about it during this meeting. You asked me about how Slovenia values the membership. Yes, very high, and it is very visible. But in the process, we also lost something. We lost our traditional industry. Slovenia was an industrial country with the 200 years of industrial transition, with the factories producing electronics, automotive industry, electronic industry, different kind of machinery. So it was a strong industrial part of former Yugoslavia. And then we were very soon persuaded that we should get rid of everything. This wave of neoliberalistic freedom in economy has prevailed, and all of a sudden we realized that we have sold everything we had. And now it's even worse. We have our entire producing economy is just as auxiliary part of German industry, partly Austrian and French. So this was the loss and some kind of sacrifice of this process. Maybe the most important one. But we are still also in the state building phases. Transition is a long process. Nobody should have illusion that it can be done fast. There is no quick fix in this regard. And if you see the problems in Poland and in Hungary and in Romania with the rule of law, we have the same problems with our judicial institutions, with the justice being slow and selective. So the same applies, of course, for Croatia and some other countries in transition. So we shouldn't be scared about the new countries who might join European Union. Thank you.
Well, my next question is if the enlargement was the most successful policy of the European Union, why there is a strong skepticism among Western Europe societies towards further enlargement. We are very grateful to Visegrad Group countries for permanent support to the Western Balkans and further enlargement. They permanently gave statements and showed their support. There is also an argument used, especially by France, that the Europe should reform first and then will be ready to further enlargement. First question is that we are not still, although the date was mentioned, it doesn't look very realistic. Although Mr. Pizzula said today we had the information that Montenegro is entering to the EU next. But this is the process, and we do not aspire to enter European Union next year. Besides that, the reforms in the European Union were the most intensive in the period of accession of Big Bang Group. So it is not mutually exclusive that you reform and enlarge at the same time. So we cannot understand this argument as the main obstacle for further enlargement. Yes. So that's it. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to. I didn't know what happened before in the last panel. It came later. But we had, of course, for a longer time a discussion about whether France will be in favor of this next step for Northern Macedonia and Albania. And all the talks we had also with people in Paris and in the government, it's quite clear that the country itself and its society is not very much in favor of a non-hardcore Europe. You find that sometimes also in Italy, but in Italy there's a great thing. You have even the Northern League has a lot of entrepreneurs on the small and medium-sized enterprise who make a lot of money also outside the country in other countries in the East. But France is a kind of monolithic block. As a country, it is a statal country, it's very centralized and has an elite who was really afraid of a very diverse continent who might make the things difficult to plan. You just saw it now with von der Leyen and Goulart, the understanding of the French elite, how a parliament in Brussels can work or not, is very low. And so the possibility of the French government, I don't say that to blame, I just say it's different, is very low to understand whether an enlargement can bring us also reform possibilities. So the conservatism to keep things together is quite high. You find that also in other countries, of course, but especially in France. So on the other hand side, I would like to say what I said a little bit before. We have a kind of growing sympathy for enlargement. That shows also because people are much more feel much more secure now. The crises are not over, also the financial crisis is not over, but people are quite feel more comfortable, let's say. And the other thing is, in the European elections, you saw that you were MEP before. I mean, that was the biggest rise, not in Italy, I know, but even in France was the biggest rise of turnout in the European elections ever. More people in the Western countries are in favor of the existing system. And I think we should use this wave, and we should also underline that apart from the French question now, that it is quite a miracle to me that 27 countries are behind it, including the German Bundestag, the German Parliament, deciding this year to be in favor of it. I don't want to be too over-optimistic, but we should not allow ourselves to be too pessimistic on this. So I guess what I said before, the problem of many societies in the last 20, 30 years, and also in the West, is they didn't do the reforms, they didn't do their homework. Yeah, you had a lot of problems in Germany. You had the unification, which gave us a lot of reform possibilities, and Germany used it. People are not happy with this process. Next year there will be 30 years of German unification, and people are not happy. People are not celebrating the unification days. We don't do this. We are not happy. But maybe we just should not always make parties for this kind of things, because people understand we need to digest it. And so we should calm down a bit. We should use now this deadlock with France to discuss it more deeply, why it's going on. But I don't think that any hyper-federalist movement wants to make a core Europe now, because the treaties are allowing a lot of different speeds, and we should do this.
I mean, if I may on this, hate to be the party pooper, but I think that all four of us, in fact all five of us, agree that enlargement is a good thing and agree that it should continue in this region. And so, sort of having clarified that, I think it is worth reflecting as to why this process now is not delivering the way it should. And I think that the reason has to do with the fact that the enlargement process in the past the enlargement process today is both a victim of the success and of the failure of the enlargement in the past. Now, I think we've already discussed why it's a victim of the failure. Now, it's true, there are plenty of not particularly noble reasons why some, particularly in France, but not only in France, are resistant to enlargement. But then there are some good reasons, and we have to face it. And the good reasons are that we need to ensure that once a member state is in, that there are mechanisms to ensure that the rules still apply. And that is a real question. It's very difficult to argue against it. At the same time, the enlargement process, the Big Bang enlargement has also, its success has, the current enlargement process is a victim of that success. Precisely because it was so successful, what we've essentially done is replicated the same process in a fairly inertial manner to a region that is different, to a European Union that is different, and to a world that is different. And we cannot, sort of live in our fantasy land and not see this. We're talking about a region which has some similarities to that of Central and Eastern Europe, but a very different history, with very different issues, and then very different problems, as well as very different potentials. We're talking about a European Union that not only doubled in size, that went through a constitutional crisis, then a Eurozone crisis, then a migration crisis, then a sort of nationalist populist surge, and it is a different union. And this, I think, is really probably the most important of all. It's a different world. The Big Bang enlargement happened at a time in which we thought we lived in an end of history, in which there was an inexorable move towards democratization, modernization, Europeanization, all good things, and what a wonderful world it will be. And it was simply a question of sort of concentric circles, and, even Russia would be at some point in one of these outer rings. And that was the world that was essentially enshrined within a global system of US hegemony. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that world is gone. It was a nice world, but it's gone, And now there are different alternative models that, unfortunately, I say as a liberal, do have attraction amongst segments not only of peoples of the Western Balkans, of peoples of Western Europe, of the United States. Now, I don't mean to say by this that, therefore, it's game over, liberalism is dead, the European Union is dead. I don't believe it at all. But we are living in a world that is normatively contested in a way that it was not when the Big Bang enlargement happened. And somehow this process has to adapt to these three fundamentally different things, a different union, a different region, and a different world. Because otherwise we keep on talking the talk, but clearly we're not walking the walk, are we?
Well, I would add to your differences also the differences in the accession process, because it is much harder now. With the fundamentals first, with benchmarks, interim benchmarks, then multiplied approval procedures. So for Western Balkan countries, it's more difficult than to previous wave of enlargement. So,
but there was a war. And don't say that the war was caused in this region only, it was also caused in France and in Germany. You had this. And
what do you think post-war situation?
Yeah. Yes, of course, we can discuss about that.
Yes, but countries, Slovenia, didn't participate in this war, let us say, but Croatia did. But Croatia became member of the EU. Croatia had war with Serbia, but also in Bosnia. It didn't prevent Croatia to become the member. It's always the problem to check all aspects of the arguments that are being thrown on the table these days. Sorry, Mr. Povisil wanted to react, and then Mr. Weigel.
Okay.
I wanted to come back to your question, why there is a crisis in the positive perception of enlargement in the EU, and complement what Nathalie said. And I think, in part, and that was said, the effects of the enlargement itself are viewed as controversial because we simply are not perfect. And we are, when I say we, then I mean the countries that acceded to the EU in 2004. We are not perfect, and maybe we did frustrate some expectations of our older brothers and sisters in the West. But that is exactly what I was going to say. They are not perfect either, and well, let's admit it. They have been source of our frustration too. So this is something that's evenly spread across the EU, I would say. But I think the main reason why the skepticism vis-à-vis the enlargement is bigger today than it was 15 years ago is the succession of crises through which the EU went. And frankly, it would be difficult to say that any of these crises was Europe-made. All of them, or most of them, were external crises that hit Europe, and Europe had to cope with them the way it could and the way it knew to cope with them. And quite frankly, we were not, perfect at all in coping with these crises, be that the financial, economic, migration, etc., because these crises showed that the divergence in opinion how to address these crises is far larger than we would have thought before these crises. And the East-West divide was not the only one. Look at the Euro crisis. The East-West divide was irrelevant in this crisis. It's a North-South divide, which is equally profound, equally important, and equally to the very essence of the EU and the integration process. And all of that became evident against the backdrop of a relatively recent enlargement. That, in my view, and I spent 6 long years sitting in Brussels and going through hundreds of meetings, in my view, that produced a certain feeling of nostalgia in some, and then the Luxembourgese articulated that when they started convening the meetings, the informal meeting of the 6 founding members of the EU, to the, I would say, disgrace or frustration of not only the newest members, but also the middle ones, Sweden, Finland, Austria, because they were not included either. And all of that, of course, creates an environment in which the perception of yet another enlargement is even more difficult than it was before.
I think that the picture of the reasons why the future enlargement, from the point of view of traditional democracies in Western Europe, looks problematic, is also the situation which we are facing here. If the most of yours, probably at least in this panel, don't watch the television in the evening. I was watching now in Belgrade. And I was upset. I couldn't believe my ears that, the country which used to be avant-garde as far as the media is concerned in the former Yugoslavia. Media in Serbia were better than in the most of the other part in the former common state, creative, and if you watch it now, it is more or less a propaganda machine of very, very, I don't want to go too far, but far enough. Democracy is a serious issue. And also in Serbia, it should be clear that what is democratic and what is not democratic. To make the pressure on media, to make them being servant of propaganda, to make opposition irrelevant, to frustrate the every opposition so far that they don't even participate in the parliamentary work. It is unacceptable. It looks bad as far as the legitimacy of governance in the country is concerned. And this is not only in Serbia, it is also in Albania like that. It was in Macedonia, North Macedonia now, excuse me, and of course in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So from the point of view of somebody who is not informed about the horrible history of these parts of Europe, it is a mess. And why should you take this mess on board and have the mess in your own home? So I think it would be very, very good if from the conferences like this one, the news, the message would be spread. You should be serious with democracy. No? And don't believe that we are so stupid that we don't see, that we don't know, that we are ignorant of what is in the reality going on with the democratic values. So I said to myself before I came here, I have to say this, even if I make myself not very popular in this political crisis.
Well, thank you. There is an ugly bride that EU has to marry. So we have to do something ourselves, yeah, for sure. But Brussels administration didn't criticize these developments enough. And didn't undertake measures to contribute to bring changes.
Because otherwise the risk that we're in now is a risk in which basically, there's a dance going on both sides. And that tragically everyone's happy with the status quo, there's a sort of pretense to, democratize and reform, and there's a pretense of an enlargement process. And, the risk is there. And this is why I think, one has to address those fundamental reasons that explain why is it that we're in this situation. It's not lost, and I think we all believe in it, but obviously something has to change to get out of this dance that we're in.
And to get out of the history and historical hatred and horrible thing which the young people are learning now happened in the past.
I profit a lot from that people get out of history traps because I was born in 1970. I can remember very well in the 80s that I got called Nazi not just because I came from Germany. That stopped completely for my son. So there's a way out of it. So we can do this. But what I wanted to say is, and I appreciate very much what you said about freedom of press, of corruption, of transparency, democracy. This what the Danish, again, this ambassador call the small democracy between people and the state. I mean, Berlusconi was in the age of before internet came up. he was very successful with traditional TV media. What we learn about conspiracy theories, about how media is controlled by certain companies in France. And then I come to the country we all are surprised of, is Britain. That we speak this wonderful language so well is because there were a big admiration for us. I grew up in a city where there are still 20,000 soldiers in my home city, in Paderborn, and they might go back now, but too late because of Brexit, and they taught the police in my home city how to behave well, how to deal with civil rights. They were doing public radio in our state. They were doing education. They had the communal system for democracy. They built this up, not just the Americans, especially the British. And where do we see now this country? So what you're suffering, I think all the countries after the Big Bang are doing fairly well in comparison what experienced democracy like Britain are doing now.
Yes,
so, and
out there.
yes, and then we talked about America. We can be happy about the situation now in Italy because I see that an odd parliamentarian system is gaining back power in a certain way. That even Salvini said yesterday the euro is irreversible. So there is a possibility to gain back control for democracy. We should not just look like the rabbit at the snake, just to be afraid. And we have to invest in democratic structure, and not just here, and I completely agree with you, but when the German government is dealing with governments as a premier government, like in Turkey now, I don't call now this country, then of course there is an advantage for that government to do things maybe in a better way. So we have to look at it, and the pluralism is the only answer, and not just in the country, but Europe-wide. The pluralism is the answer to get this done. Now I can translate Hungarian into German because Google Translation is fairly good now. I understand what Orban is saying in his tweets. I know it now. It's completely different from 5 years ago. So we have to use it. We have to say it. Come on, what is going on there? So, and the last thing, because our flag is a European flag with stars and When I grew up, it was like this flag of the bureaucrats, something like in Brussels. But now when you see this flag on streets in Europe, everywhere, Italy didn't see that so much now, but mainly in most of the countries where there's corruption, transparency, there is this flag coming up. So it shows a little bit there's a standard which is understood by people, but the countries and the governments are not able to use it in a favor to make a new wave of strategy, to make a democratic pattern, a democratic standard available for all the countries, not just for the accession countries, because then it would be easier to criticize this country when something goes wrong, when you do their own homework. And France, Germany, Italy, especially Britain, we didn't do the homework. We were rolling back. So we have to be very, very self-critical before we go to others.
So I would like to come back to something what Natalie said. Our region is in the trap of circumstances because in 2008 we were much closer to the European Union. Psychologically, the climate, the enthusiasm, the drive for reforms in 2008, so it was 11 years ago. Macedonia, 2 decades ago, not 2 decades, previous decade, was at the beginning of previous decade, Macedonia was closer to the European Union than Croatia. And what happened? And if you keep the situation stagnant, there is no chance for real changes, whatever the reasons are. So the problem is how to take the region out of this stalemate.
I mean, I think that there is something, going back to a point, Martin, that you were making, which was basically the ill side of differentiation. I think there is merit in looking at the virtues of differentiation. And to me, it really, and this may be the key. The point is, it depends how you frame it. And this is why rules and laws and institutions are so important. If you frame it politically, we decide who's in, who's out, then obviously it has a devastating effect and it sort of fuels centrifugal forces not only inside the union but also outside it as well. And indeed, so it sort of fuels this sense of discrimination within, and you rightly say not only in the Central and Eastern European member states, but also in the Nordic member states and the southern enlargement of the 1980s countries. So it's a widespread feeling, basically. And it obviously fuels this sense of discrimination and moving goalposts, which was basically what you were mentioning, this idea of there are new rules of the game as we move ahead. If differentiation is framed in a far more sort of politically neutral way, and it's basically saying rules and responsibilities come along with rights. So, I say this as an Italian, not a particularly popular position to take as an Italian. Italy, do you want to be in the Eurozone? Yes. Well, I'm sorry. These are the rules of the game. But then I would say, do you, Poland or the Czech Republic, want to be in Schengen? Well, if you do, then the rules of the game is that we have to move towards whatever, a common asylum system and a common migration policy. And the same goes for defence. The problem then becomes, and then it becomes a healthy differentiation, where responsibilities come with rights, and where there isn't someone that sort of ex cathedra says, who is it, that can be in and can be out. But so to me, this is a necessary and healthy conversation about differentiation. And to me, this is actually a debate that should be had not only within the European Union, but also taken in the Western Balkans. Now, hopefully when Brexit will be over, we will start discussing about the next, multi-annual financial framework, and the theme of conditionality is there. What do countries of the Western Balkans think about it? Have the countries that are in the enlargement process, that indeed do not directly participate in the negotiation, have those voices heard?
Sorry, you wanted also to add something?
I wanted to make a comment on what Ivo suggested, about history. But that's somehow a couple of minutes ago. But I did want to offer the two pieces of lessons that I think that are worthwhile considering, and they come from Czech and Slovak or Czechoslovak history, if you like. I know it's difficult to forget history, but we are an example of the fact that to split a country in a peaceful manner is possible, and I think we know that it's well seen here in the Balkans, but the lesson still applies, because here Yugoslavia split in a completely different manner, but it still should not be impossible to change it into something that is peaceful, difficult as it may be. And the second piece of experience that we have made, when I think back, to the very beginning of the 1990s, after the changes, we are in an anniversary year. You see the badge on my suit. We had a very difficult relation with our biggest neighbor, that was Germany, and we knew that if we mean the ambition to return to the West, then the first thing we need to do is to just arrange in a different way our relations with Germany. Just to bury past and look into the future. It took us, Bent, I don't know if you remember it, but it took us 7 years during which we negotiated the so-called Czech-German Declaration that was adopted as late as 1997. But that was the moment that opened the way for Czech Republic, Slovakia already out of the federation. That opened the way to our integration both into NATO and the EU. So again, there is a way, how to get over the legacies of past, and on the Czech political scene, you will no longer, and I don't think it's conceivable at all, to have a discussion about war reparation payments to Czech Republic from Germany. That's dead. We have managed to overcome it both ways, from Germany and from the Czech Republic. And I think this is something, that made our path into the EU much smoother than if we hadn't done this. And this is, I think, a lesson that still applies here in this region.
Well, thank you very much for this comment, because I just want to say that Macedonia did something similar. Settled relations with Greece, settled relations with Bulgaria, and there is no award, there is no recognition, there is no support. So it doesn't function the same way related to different countries, unfortunately. This was an excellent example of using the momentum. But Macedonia will enter NATO. Maybe this will speed up the process.
I refuse to say that this game is over. That was the Council decision yesterday, and the criticism what I see also in German media about this is quite high. It's crazy. It has completely changed. Before in Germany, everybody was against any enlargement, and now it's about this is not fair. We know what happened during the migration crisis. We know what was going on there. And Northern Macedonia, of course, was not able to deal with it well. Others were more smart to show the nice pictures, including this government here. But in any case, people in Germany understood with the migration crisis that there needs to be done some also for the sake of our own security. So, and the other one is what I always say when I come again to my home region, like it's a little bit the same as in northern Italy, when you have small, medium-sized enterprises being world champion in certain things, I don't know what, microphones, glasses, whatever, they know there's trade. They know that there is something going on, and still in the Western Balkan region, the trade is higher than within here. And people know that in business, but they don't say that always out loud. So there is a change, a positive change towards the differentiation. I call that pluralism. And with this pluralism comes also checks and balances. I can understand, whatever age you have, you must be very disappointed here in this region about what is going on and how slow this is. But what is the trade of this country with the EU, and what is the trade with China and with Russia? Look at the figures. Yeah? So the only way to get out of it is that we understand, we use.
The figures can increase.
Yeah, but again, I really believe in business which is multilateral and which is flexible. And the biggest backbone of German economy is small and medium-sized enterprises. It's not the big Volkswagen players. It is the small and medium-sized enterprises. And those don't need state-driven business. This is for sure another cup of tea. And again, a little bit of hope. I'm not so happy with what happened now with France and von der Leyen and how she was elected and not elected and not known to the European election, which was a success story in Europe. Nobody expected it. I think the good part of von der Leyen, what at least she's doing, even with Poland, is a differentiation. First time people are happy with this kind of thing, thinking that it's not just Germany, France. We are criticizing more and more, also European move in Germany, alongside with our Paris friends, we're criticizing the Franco-German rhetorics. That has to stop in a certain way. We have to go also to this differentiation, because otherwise everybody's either lying behind this couple or is criticizing this couple all the time. We should go further. Also, the smaller states have a responsibility. So, let's take this crisis, smaller crisis from yesterday, as a big warning that we have to find a bigger strategy.
Thank you for this information. We are going to sleep better this night with expectations. Regarding France, maybe it would be good to intensify migration from our region in the direction of France, because you learned about us, you know us, so we are more acceptable for you.
The German ambassador in Paris told me once, all of a sudden France is not anymore at the Mediterranean. All of a sudden they didn't have these problems.
So
this is polemic,
maybe this is a good recipe. But I wanted to say something else, a bit more optimistic. What do you think about mechanisms to integrate our region, not formally, but sectorally? The whole connectivity agenda, the digital agenda, everything that happened after the peak of migration crisis, resulted in deeper integration. I think this border control, police, etc., this was linked with migration crisis, but digital agenda has also security aspects. But connectivity agenda, these are doors which could be maybe widely open for the region. We don't need to have full membership, but we are going to be integrated. That everything that happened to Berlin process, in fact, it was opening some doors for deeper integration of our region in some sectors, in some policies of the European Union. How do you see prospects in this direction?
I mean, I think it's essential because I think even in the best of circumstances, and the best of circumstances is that our great leaders see the light in the next 48 hours and have the courage that the General Affairs Council did not have. So even in that circumstance, which is obviously at this point, even unhoped, sort of optimistic scenario, it's clear that it's not enough. I mean, it's clear that we're in it still for the long haul. And so I think that the intuition of the Berlin process, of the 2018 Commission strategy, it is all there on paper. It started being there in part in the practice too, but I think we would probably all agree, not enough. So there has to be more in precisely the direction that you were mentioning. I go back to the point I was making about the budget, the MFF. That is the place to start. For any of these things. I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about money, whether it's for infrastructure, connectivity. I mean, it is ultimately, it does boil down to a large extent to money, and therefore it's fundamental that when we're talking about the funds that will be directed to foreign policy in general, I mean, the proposal that has been put on the table is for a 30% increase of money directed to European foreign policy, I mean, to the external side. So obviously this is spread out. This is the kind of thing that needs to happen in order to give substance to the kind of things that up until now had to be done within the framework of the existing financial cycle.
We have to give floor to the public. And regarding what you said, Mr. Fouché underlined that, in fact, Serbia is getting 10 times less than Bulgaria from the EU budget, that the budget should be increased for the Western Balkans. The same thesis, we are coming to conclusions. And, but please, I would like to invite the public.
Thank you very much. I'm representing country of the Eastern Neighborhood Project, Georgia. So it was very interesting to me to hear the confronting perspectives about the possible integration of the Western Balkan countries to European Union, because we are also very much interested in the European Union, to say it mildly. So my question is, in a very practical terms, specifically referring to Serbia, how on earth it is possible for Serbia to become a European Union member while several key European Union countries do not recognize Kosovo as an independent country? So once it enters the European Union, this critical issue has to be resolved on the first place. And I really hardly imagine Spain recognizing Kosovo as an independent country, having such violent events on the streets of Barcelona now. This is my first question. And the second question is referring to the European Union as you said a differentiation to become a kind of a positive point or positive side of the European Union. And to me, it is more like a negative aspect, because differentiation sometimes is very synonym to the differences in division. So the idea of Europe of different speeds, or Europe with different speeds of integration, where the France and Germany represent a more kind of integrative power, and the Poland and others, and Hungary, that do not want to enter into deeper integration process. Don't you think that this differentiation of Europe is more like a threat and challenge to its future rather than the positive aspect? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall we collect 3 questions and then Mr. Međak?
Thank you very much. Vladimir Međak, European Movement in Serbia. I have one relatively short comment and the question at the end. I completely agree with Ms. Toci when she says that methodology of negotiations has to be changed. The current methodology actually doesn't work, because after 19 years of accession negotiations and stabilization association process, only one country joined, Croatia, in 2003. And in 2011, for instance, in case of Serbia, European Commission estimated that within 5 years, with significant effort, Serbia can finish everything and be fully harmonized. We are currently in the 6th year of accession negotiations, and we haven't reached even half of the job that has to be done. Basically, the problem is the same methodology, more or less, that is used in Eastern Enlargement is used here, but the very essence of the job is missing, and that is the push factor from candidate countries and the lack of pull factor by the European Union. Just as an example, going back in history, 2,000 years ago, Romans built one bridge, 1,200 meters long, within 2 years over the Danube. That was the biggest bridge in Europe for the next 2,000 years. Serbia needs 3 years to write an action plan for Chapter 19 social policy. In these 3 years of writing this action plan, EU has not asked a single time, why is it taking so long? So nobody's actually asking the question, why are we wasting time? Where is the money and time spent for? So basically methodology has to be changed in order to have this push factor. So Serbia is having a steady decline in democracy. Freedom House has reduced our level of democracy to partially free. All this happened during accession negotiations. So the country, in the course of accession negotiations, should be improving its position vis-à-vis acquis, not reducing it. So the question is, we hear some unofficial rumors that new obstacles in this accession methodology will be introduced, making it more difficult to finish accession negotiations. How is it possible that this methodology, not giving a result, can be improved by making it even more difficult? So what can be done with this methodology in order to make it happen that the reality is changed? Because we are ticking the box. Serbia is opening some accession, some chapters, Serbia is delivering some documents, but reality is staying the same or even going backwards.
Okay, so I'll actually try and tie some of these answers together. I mean, to the question, can Serbia ever become a member so long as the question of Kosovo is not solved, given that a number of member states don't recognize Kosovo? I mean, my answer very bluntly would be it's obviously a necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition. And I think it's really important to keep on driving that point home, because in the kind of climate, and here I tie it precisely to that third comment, in a climate in which it is not simply a question of reforms being slow and democratization being slow, but we're basically talking about a process of de-democratization, that, it is sort of the message of basically saying, well, actually, the only thing that matters is Kosovo. And so don't bother us with rule of law and democracy, because we know all you were interested in is Kosovo. And it's that, and yes, obviously it is of primary importance, but it is, the fact that it is of primary importance does not mean to say that it is the only thing that is of importance, because in a sense, hypothetically, let's imagine a situation in which at some point there is an agreement between Serbia and Kosovo, but that democratic backsliding continues. Would there be enlargement? No, there wouldn't be enlargement. Would an EU that is, for its own reasons, having cold feet about all this, would they do something about it? No. I mean, they would have solved the security urgency would have been solved. And so this is why it becomes so important to keep on making those 2 points and making them at the same time. The other point that I wanted to say is, again, sort of clarifying this issue about differentiation. Of course, and I go back to what I said, it depends how you do it. You can do it in a manner that really does fuel centrifugal forces and divisions, or in a manner that does exactly the reverse. What is completely unacceptable is actually the situation that we have today. The situation that we have today is that you have some member states entering some things and using the fact that they enter those particular domains of closer integration to block things. This is the reality. Let's take a field that we haven't talked about at all. Defence. 25 member states joined PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation on Defence. Do you really think that all 25 member states are fulfilling the criteria that they signed up to? No, of course they're not. But given that they're 25 member states, there will always be a blocking minority preventing anything to be done against those member states that are not in compliance. And you can make this argument about other policy areas as well. So, there is virtue in being clear about what the rules are. If you want to be in this, you have to respect certain rules, but in order to make that credible, you have to ensure that the institutional form that form of differentiated integration is, makes it very clear what the rights are, but also what the responsibilities are, and ensures that there are sort of compliance mechanisms to it.
Mr. Povic, you wanted?
To make a comment on differentiations also. I think it was in the first question, there was a sub-question about leadership in European Union. I think it is totally unacceptable that Germany and France would proclaim themselves to be directorium of European Union. It shouldn't happen. With the Brexit, if it will happen, if we don't know yet, there is the structure of the big countries who had more say than the other, and it was kind of acceptable in certain circumstances. I think it should not be substituted with the directorium between Berlin and Paris. But of course, it is important that these two countries agree, and they have a kind of leadership. It is undisputable. Then, second thing, I think that the leading role in European Union with the politicians like Donald Trump is compromised. I don't think that we should unconditionally be silent or follow the mistaken policy of United States of America, better said, of White House. We should be critical and cooperative. It is, of course, important that we have transatlantic relations active and productive, and I think we should also honor the role United States have played in the history, especially after World War II, but not in the terms to ask the Kurds if they were in Normandy or not. It is not so easy and so simple. But the leadership should be European for European affairs. This is my modest opinion. I don't represent any government, anybody else, but my personal view. Thank you.
I agree with Natalie. Without solving the Kosovo problem between Belgrade and Pristina, there is no accession of Serbia to the EU. That's clear as that. And again, if Serbia is not democratic, there is no accession to the EU. It's as clear as that. And I'm unable to say which of them is more important. They're both important because the criteria are firmly set. Copenhagen, we mentioned that, and they are valid. Do we need a new methodology on enlargement? Probably we need some modifications, but I would warn against modifications that we end up as the enhanced cooperation Natalie mentioned. So, streamlined methodology that would be clear, more straightforward, yes, but well, I know how we operate in Brussels. We tend to make things even more complicated than they are on many occasions, and I think the PESCO example is an excellent one because basically this is that. And thirdly, on differentiation, I'm not afraid of multi-speed Europe. Multi-speed Europe is fine if it's developed along clear criteria, as was mentioned. Do you want to be in Schengen? These are the rules. Go ahead. Do you want to be in PESCO? These are the rules. Go ahead. Euro, etc. What I would be afraid of is a two-speed Europe. And this is what Ivo aims at, no directorium, because then we are, well, probably at the beginning of the end of the road of European integration.
We had this discussion also in Germany about this two-speed Europe for a long time, but this is over. And I don't. There's a rising resistance against this Franco-German directorate idea, which might be for some people in the Chancellery useful. For the rest of the country, it is something what gives a lot of fear in certain aspects, because people see that Europe is really much, much bigger than France and Germany. So what is quite important, I guess, is, of course, to include this friendship in solution making, of course. But it's not let's face it, it's not a friendship. There are no two bigger countries which are so different from each other. It is about making the difference workable together. So it's not about friendship anymore, because my grand-grandfather, he occupied Belgium and not France. So we have a lot of old enemies around us. So we have to differentiate also this kind of history, thinking this is one of the topics which came before. Again, about this differentiation part, I believe in complicated democratic systems. We have to make the European Union more democratic. We also, many people are against a Eurozone budget which is not controlled by parliaments. This is impossible. Yeah, so there we go. We're gonna have a EU with an EU budget which needs to deal somehow with the North-South divide and needs to deal somehow with the overcoming the economic crisis in the Eurozone. But this is also differentiation. So we have to keep the Commission and the Parliament as the core institutions alive and stronger. And what Macron was facing now is a kind of an interesting part, because Parliament is showing that they are somehow more strong than other national parliaments. And there come again to this point of how we deal with this EU as it is now. We have a set of law, we have the community law, which is quite respected. We have a copyright law, which is crazy widespread, and which also affects Serbia, which also affects, I guess, even Georgia. We have a lot of other laws which came up, data protection law, which are even affecting American companies. So that there is a kind of standard which is more and more respected. Even the German Constitutional Court more and more understands that they cannot do what they want in the end of the day. So we have to, the checks and balances is one part, but we have to bind ourselves to each other, that if you change this part of the differentiated integration, there's a bad consequence maybe in another part. And that sounds very complicated, but I admire complicated systems, because they are the only ones making minorities and different needs alive and keep them alive, and not just to make it authoritarian from top down. And there, I even from the European movement, I completely agree with everybody who's afraid of a super power in Brussels, which is just run by technocrats. This is what we don't need.
Well, maybe this is a good conclusion of our panel. Thank you very much for your contribution. Maybe our views are closer than we supposed when we started the debate, and we hope to continue in different format, in different places, this kind of debates which are very precious for our region. We should take part in these European debates, as Natalie mentioned, because being out of that, our public is not aware at all what is going on in Europe, and then you can sell whatever you want. So thank you very much, and our panel is over.